replanted them, and now they just have to wait 30 years.
Call us to order here, and I'll do a quick roll call. Gary?
Yes, sir.
Want to start off?
I'm here. Jerry Herman.
Okay, Brian Boyce.
Richard Graven.
Eric Carr. Okay, thank you. See, am I on? I think that is.
Sure your lights are on your
Yeah, on
speakers,
your mic if
and
you want to speak. So
when you're speaking, keep your mouth close to the mic, please. Close to the mic.
the first event on our agenda here is for David Fraser, our city manager, to give a presentation on urban forestry and his ideas in that direction.
Thank you, Chairman Boyce. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I watched video your last meeting, and on behalf of the mayor and council, I want to thank all of you for your service to the community. Restoring this committee and the work that you're undertaking is among the council's goals for the last 2 years. And also the council has been, I think, very visionary in encouraging the staff and I to advocate on behalf of urban forestry, to budget for that. They've approved additional funds each of the last 2 years for urban forestry efforts. But there's a lot left to do. And we're going to need your help and all of us working together to accomplish that. I think the reason I sort of volunteered this is at the last meeting I heard Jerry mention that I had a vision for urban forestry, and the mayor's heard me say this before, but my vision is whatever the council says it's going to be. And I mean that with all deference and respect, because the council are the elected body, and that doesn't mean that I don't give them recommendations. And I also have a personal vision or a professional vision that, if allowed to achieve it and encouraged to do so by the community and the elected officials, then I would do that. Certainly when I think about Oregon City's potential, I've only lived in Oregon about 6 years, and then that time I've seen areas where in the state where we've clear-cut entire mountainsides and valleys. I've seen areas in the state where we've replanted. I've seen areas in the state where we've selectively harvested. But most of my focus has been on what other cities in the state have done regarding the urban forestry canopy and the restoration of it, or whether they've tried to maintain it. I think when I look at our canopy, I guess what I'd really like to have is a way to sustainably fund a more concentrated effort and focus on urban forestry. And I think eventually that's going to include probably looking at the addition of an urban forester position on the city staff. That's going to need to have a stable funding source, and a position like that could probably be funded through a parks utility fee, and I know the commission has asked us to look at that further, and we are doing that. And the reason this utility fee, and the council has heard me talk about this before, but on behalf of this committee, I want to explain the virtue of a utility fee for a city like Oregon City that has over $1 million a year in taxes that they don't collect just on county-owned property, because we're the county seat. And because of that, the taxpayers that are here are basically funding services for the impacts caused by the fact that we're a major employment center for the region, and yet much of our tax base is exempt from taxation, from property tax. So to avoid disproportionately burdening local taxpayers, cities in our situations many times will look at utility fees, because tax-exempt entities pay their water bill and their sewer bill and other utility bills just like the rest of us, and they also would pay a parks utility fee just like the rest of us. So we're doing some of that research now to see how we can equitably come up with a fee that would be acceptable to the commission and the community.
So just a quick question.
Yeah.
Does that mean it's attached to the utility bill?
That's probably how it would be. Just like you get when you get your bill now, you see a pavement management utility fee, and that's for street maintenance. And so this fee would be for parks and parks maintenance, and that could, and part of that money could go to fund for an urban forester position. But in the meantime, with or without that position, or without that funding source, I've directed my staff to look at areas in the city where we don't have overhead impediments or underground obstacles to planting heritage trees, and we're identifying dozens and dozens of those sites now. And we're going to continue doing that, and I think with the help of this committee we're going to be able to find additional sites. When it comes time to adopt things like a utility fee or develop other policies, of course, natural resource policy is going to be a lot of what you folks help us develop. And I would hope that when it's time to try to fund those through utility fees and other mechanisms, that the Commission would be able to count on your support throughout the community to help educate our constituents about that effort and the value of it. I think most of us understand urban forestry at probably a deeper level than the average person, because we wouldn't be here talking about it tonight. So I'm not going to go into all of the economic benefits, but I think for our tax base, for the future of heating and cooling and air quality, the urban forest canopy in our community is vitally important. And cities who have studied this, in my hometown of Kansas City actually is one of those examples. There's some shopping districts there where many years ago urban forestry was initiated by the city, and there was lots of resistance from the business community because they were afraid it was going to block signs and storefronts and otherwise impede their business and cause a big pain in the neck that they didn't want to deal with. So the city offered them some money to hire a consultant to study the economic impacts. And the results of the study were that people would pay up to 20% more for the exact same product if they were shopping in an area with a tree canopy, an established tree canopy. And once that information, of course, that was commissioned by the business community rather than the city. And so it had that credibility as well. And once they realized that was the case, the resistance to planting trees in urban settings was largely mitigated. And now when you go to the Country Club Plaza District, that's the one I'm talking about, you do see people, and I've shopped there before, so I know you also pay 20% more for everything there, but you're happy to do it because you're in an area that's inviting. I mean, we're all primates, like it or not. We do like trees, even if we're not sure why. We just know it feels different when we're in those areas. When I was city manager of Grants Pass, we had an annual conference here in Portland, and we were staying downtown at one of the hotels, and we weren't talking city business, so no open records violations, but we were walking through the city going to a conference, and all of my commission members were commenting on, gosh, it just feels so different. Why does Portland feel so alive and so energetic, and why do we like being here so much? And one of my commission members was a scientist and had studied urban forestry, and rather than me having to say that, said, "It's the trees, guys. Look, it's the trees." And of course, everywhere we looked, there was these giant trees, and they were buckling the curb, and they were causing problems on the sidewalk, but they were there nonetheless. And that's really the challenge for us, is not to look at some of the physical challenges of large trees in these areas as a reason why we can't do something. It just challenges us to be more creative in how we approach it. But we can still do it. It's going to be challenging. And I think, Jerry, you might have said something about the understory trees and that subcanopy, if you will, the dogwoods and those other varietals that grow in that subcanopy. I think that's a very important component of urban forestry as well. But I'd like to, at some point, have the city sponsor an urban forestry plan, do an inventory, and then have a forester hired, and then basically we go about setting whatever that canopy goal is, that percent, and then we start achieving it, like a master plan that we would do for any other department, any other vital city service. And that's really where we need to go. And regardless of what that percentage of the canopy was that was going to be there. For me, I'm probably a little extreme on that. I would be shooting something for 70 or 80%. That might be hard to achieve, so based on what the results were, we might have to aim for something more realistic. But my staff has heard me say this before, and you guys have probably heard this: the best time to plant a tree was 50 years ago, and the second best time is today. And so we're doing it. We're doing it now to a larger extent than we have, I think, in the last decade. And it's going to take a while for it to show up. But we just had recently an urban forestry event. I wasn't able to attend, but the mayor was there, and there was a big turnout. Lots of kids were involved. People took trees and the little seedlings, they took them home and planted them. And, that education piece is also very important. And I hope that by the end of the next 12 months, sometime in the next 12 months, that we will have an announcement that Oregon City has achieved its Tree City USA status. That's something we've been working on for about the last 18 months, and is also something that we've been encouraged to do by the City Commission. So that's a little capsule on urban forestry, and But I'm happy to have discussion with you or answer any questions that you might have or things that we should think about moving forward.
Yeah, I have a question for David. The fee attached to essentially utility bills, is there any other examples of that happening? I mean, there's stormwater fees being assessed now and so forth. I mean, is that,
Well, I think the one that's probably the most close to what we would end up with is our pavement management utility fee that we have right now, and that's for restoring pavement in damaged areas of our street system. But the parks utility fee would work similar. There would have to be a methodology. There would be probably a breakdown for large commercial sites like a Home Depot, for example, versus a smaller store in our downtown, which would pay a less, so the fee structure has to have some rational relationship to the impact that's being caused. But yeah, basically it means that there are many more riders on the bus. Everybody's helping to pay for it instead of just a residential property taxpayer. And in a city that has $1 million worth of tax-exempt county-owned property in it, that's that's a pretty big factor not to have them contributing in some meaningful way.
and in light of that, since some of those organizations like Clackamas County have a strong interest in the green agenda, sustainability, et cetera, I think the college does too.
Right.
I don't know how much the school district can expend in effort, but I wonder if one strategy could be also an effort to approach them on the basis of the livability aspect that will benefit them and also their, them and also their constituents.
Right.
It just seems like, I didn't realize it was $1 million, but, if we could achieve half of that through other voluntary contributions from their organizations, because
Well,
they
there
were-
are counties that make payments in lieu of taxes, and there
Yeah.
is really, in this recession, there's been a national trend in
Right.
other cities that have, for example, large universities. The one I just read about this week was Brown University is going to start making, $500,000 contributions to their host city. We're not going to be in that situation here because Clackamas County doesn't have Brown's endowment. And counties are reluctant to do this. I mean, there are some back east that have done these payment in lieu of taxes, but it's pretty rare. And so cities just have to be creative. And this utility fee is certainly one that
Right.
I think is it's lawful in Oregon. There are a couple of other cities that have done it. And I think it's more compelling for us because of our unique situation as a regional center and a county seat.
And because they would be contributing through that utility assessment, and their properties quite often are large, perhaps it would be even more
Of course, we want to make sure that it's fair and reasonable. So the methodology, and Scott Archer is actually our department head who's leading that research. The methodology is going to have to be reasonable so that the county isn't all of a sudden seeing a $500,000 increase in its operations costs.
Right.
We have to be careful that we don't do something that's going to really hurt people and based on their ability to pay and absorb it. And when the city enacted its pavement management utility fee, it actually implemented it slowly slowly. Every year it went up until it hit a certain amount. And gradually phasing it in like that is probably also more reasonable, and I would expect we'll be encouraging a similar approach to the parks fee as well. We have a lot of deferred maintenance in our parks, and even in our park buildings, like the pool building. So we're probably going to call it. I'm going to encourage the commission to give themselves some flexibility in how they spend it, and so that would probably be looking at a parks and open space utility fee, so that if they needed to spend some of that money in the right of way, they could still do that, because we do have a lot of public spaces, just like the promenade out here. Not necessarily a park per se,
Right.
not what most people would consider a park, but nonetheless it's a public space and has a lot of urban forestry needs there. And so I'm going to try to encourage it to be as more flexible so that the commission can use the money where it's needed. Not a good time to talk about extra fees because people are, every penny counts, but it's also not fair to our residents to disproportionately place those burdens on them. And I think that's actually been happening for many, many years. So,
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any more questions?
okay.
Okay, let's move on. We've got.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Sure.
joining us. Thank you.
We've got Lori Griffith, who's the volunteer coordinator.
Can I sit here or what?
Yeah, you can sit there. There's a mic right there for you. is going to talk about volunteerism.
Is my microphone on? No? Do I push a button?
Yeah, it should have a
Light
little
should
red
go on.
light.
All right. Now? Now? Yes.
Yeah, that
All right.
sounds like it's
Hi,
working.
I'm Lori Griffith. I'm a citizen of West Lynn. I'm on the Parks and Rec Advisory Board. I'm also a master gardener and a Solve ambassador. And I spent a lot of time using these creative tools to work at Mary S. Young Park. That is a state park. And I've recruited through the last 5 years, with the help of Solve, about 5,000 hours of volunteer help in the restoration of the forest in that park. And Brian has been in that park, as has Jerry, and it's gone from being a heavily invasive park with ivy and clematis and cherries to actually having some beautiful open paths, and it's very accessible to people who are runners and people walking their dogs. So we've really taken that park. It's a partnership between the state of Oregon, because it's still a state of Oregon park, and it's being managed by the city of West Lynn. And the city of West Lynn didn't have a whole lot of money to put into the restoration, so we have come up with a plan. It was a 5-year plan. We're kind of renewing it as every 3 years or so. And I worked with a gentleman named Dave Cruz. He actually has a group of volunteers that meet Monday and Wednesday, and it's men, and they have a little bit of a competition going on. They work on trails, they work on removing invasives, and they work from 9 to 3. So one of the successful things for that volunteer group is a set time where people know every Monday and every Wednesday they can go and they can work and be in the camaraderie of retired men and make a difference. I do a monthly non-native plant removal and environmental education program that's sponsored by Solve. And Solve is really the platform for my success at Mary S. Young Park. I took a formal training through Solve, which Solve is the largest volunteer organization in the state of Oregon. As you know, they do a beach cleanup every year. They do riverbank restoration. I've also used the resources of Willamette River Keeper. They have some training and they have some support that they give to us. But the monthly work crews that we have are mainly supported through churches and high school students. And we get a few occasional Boy Scouts that need a merit badge. So the high school likes to come because within the organization of Solve, they actually have a nice form that we can give the kids for the hours that they work. So that's of value. And the church groups, they do it because they need to do community service and they like to commune with nature, and it's a lovely place to work. However, in the summertime, we do limit some of the participation because there's a lot of bees in the park. And so that's something we consider always, is the safety of our volunteers, whether or not, it's windy and a limb might fall or bees might attack them. So in the last 5 years, Solve has estimated that the Saturday volunteers have removed about 30,000 pounds of invasive plants. And this is at no cost to the city of West Lynn at all. This is all through volunteer organization. And within that, the 5,000 hours, the city considers about $20 an hour for the kind of work that goes on. So you can extrapolate the math. And that's just with my once a month group. Now, if you had a group like Dave Cruz and the men, they have 5 to 7 men twice a week for 3 hours. Now, they have done tremendous work. They've done stream restoration. So the consistency of having the time frame can always on the website. We also have an e-blast that we send out before our events, and we're posted on Solve. And so all of these tools on the internet that social networking has been very successful, plus the consistency of kids knowing, hey, I need to have 3 more hours for my Honor Society fulfillment. I'm going to go to the park. Another thing I do, particularly at Mary S. Young State Park, is I've created a nature walking trail. We call it an interpretive trail. I've also created a natural garden so people can easily identify plants So they understand the purpose of removing ivy and clematis and the cherries is to open up that lower canopy so the native plants can come back, so they get a real feel for what they should be looking for. And sometimes we even had kids, Boy Scout troops in particular, stake out one place where they'll pull for a couple of years and they'll actually literally see the change from an ivy-covered ground and ivy-covered trees to actually seeing some vanilla leaf or Oregon grape or whatever would be there normally. And then the birds come in, and so we really enclose the environmental piece to it. So they're doing community service. That's a value. It's a dependable time, but they actually are seeing results through their understanding of nature. So that's kind of... I did want to say one thing. Friends of Trees, your director, Dave Frazier, I don't know if he knows about Friends of Trees, but about 20 years ago I worked with them on some urban corridors in southeast Portland. We were doing traffic calming, and we've planted trees. We probably planted 1,000 trees in inner southeast Portland, and it really makes a difference. And Friends of Trees has the formula. They have the resources, so that might make it easier for you as your city moves forward in its urban canopy to work with Friends of Trees. So, any questions?
I have a question. I know you're a member of the Park Board.
Yes.
And I'd like to know, in addition to Mary Ash Young, it's my understanding that citywide there's a lot of volunteer activity because of the park's more than experiment, effort to encourage volunteers in all their parks. Is that true or not?
Well, we have done workshops to try to increase the number of people that we want to do outreach to participate, and it's really inconsistent to see how effective our outreach programs are. Sometimes we'll have the outreach and we'll have 10 people, and other times we'll have 50 people. So in particular, it depends on the leadership. If you have someone that's talking to the people, putting up signs, making sure that the schools know about the events, like Steve Meissen down at Burnside and Maddox Woods. That's a beautiful walkway. You can look out onto the Heron Rookery on the island that is the drainage of the Clackamas River, and it's pretty impressive. He has consistently have volunteers because he's also doing an environmental program. He's also, the people will come back and they'll see the results of their work. Wilderness Park, I don't know what goes on up there. I know that there are some work parties. There is an independent group that has done a tremendous restoration through the powers of Roberta Schwartz, and that is the Oak Savannah. And they do she's almost like a volunteer coordinator for that. She's a one-woman show, and the rest of the parks are pretty well maintained by the city. So the city does a lot of the maintenance, but some of the parks, we do the maintenance. So, well, we assist, we help. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the other thing I was going to mention, I watched very closely what was happening at Mary Ash Young State Park. That's a state park that the state of Oregon feels comfortable enough to turn over to a city to manage. And that's a pretty amazing thing because it's in this scheme of Tryon Creek State Park to be kept natural, not to intrude on the habitat, improve the habitat if possible. And the state doesn't do this. There's the only arrangement that I know of in the state of Oregon where they've turned a park of that magnitude over to a city. Now, the city's been able to negotiate. I'm giving you a pitch here because I'm just really impressed, not just with you, but what the Parks Department has done. Now they've put in a lot of active sports areas, dog park areas, massive wood and how do I say this? Screening elements of native plants to continue the native screens that were there. They haven't cut down the brush, quote unquote brush. They've kept the habitat intact, and I think the state is just really impressed with what's happened there. Now, the reason I say this is that what is making that possible? Is it your parks direction, your staff of your parks? Is it the city's attitude, or what is it that makes the state feel comfortable?
Well, it's 127 acres of multi-use. It's fantastic in that respect. So you do have soccer moms that come in. You have the runners that want to have good trails. So we have a man who's on our parks board, and that's all he does is he takes the kids from the teams that he coaches, and they help with the trails. So I think it's many avenues. The city of West Lynn was sort of like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do here? They cannot develop any of that with buildings. Although they did put a restroom in, they've redone some of the ball fields, but the city is, because it's owned by the state and because Mary S. Young had certain limitations, the city has kind of just let the volunteers say, okay, we want to restore this. We want to see this gem, this little gem, come back. And we also like the fact that there's about 3/4 of a mile of river. I didn't mention that. It's just gorgeous. So we have 3 different areas. We have riparian, we have kind of some meadowland, and then we have river. And so we want to increase sportsmanship on the river. We want to have some kayak landings. And Does that
Well,
answer?
I think it's just, I've taken groups down there and to see the activity. And they've even put in a temporary storage facility for a tractor that someone's donated so that it's always available on site.
Right.
And there's seems to be no concern between the staff of the city parks, who I know quite well, and the volunteers. It seems to be a real interactive kind of thing.
It's a good relationship.
So-
They've given us a lot of materials to work with, but it's really the volunteers. I think it's just that people felt that they were watching this beautiful urban forest slip away and become like Forest Park, which is just so overrun with ivy. And we had this tremendous leader named Dave Cruz, so I think he really spurred it forward. So if you have people that want to commune with nature and you have an opportunity this 127 acres is a lot. You can actually get away, and there's viewpoints, and there's, creeks to listen to, and there's
It's as big
plants
as
to
the college.
study.
Big as Clackamas Community College grounds.
Yeah, it's
basically.
just
Huge.
gorgeous. So.
Yeah.
So you took a section of Oak Savannah and restored it, I understand? You took a section of Oak Savannah and restored it as well?
We're in the process of that, yes.
Okay.
Norm King, who used to be our mayor, and I have been working with some crews to remove just the snowberry and kind of some of the plants. There's a beautiful section of really big old oaks along 43 and into the park. The one thing we don't have is madrone. We have never found any madrone in that park, which is kind of surprising. So.
Question: who's responsible for the overall planning, the restoration plan for the park? Is that the state or the city?
Actually, it's the volunteers. It's myself and Dave Cruz. So when we pull an area, so the first thing we did was we pulled the ivy off the trees, and then we circled that, and then we have, within the trails, we have areas that we pull, because the trails will provide a natural, breaking point. And then as we pull that, we see what comes back, and if it's so desiccated, there's some places we've tried to restore that, that there's nothing left in the soil, the ivy's sucked it out. We just look at where it is in the forest, and sometimes the natives just come up naturally, and sometimes we have to supplement it. We use Echo Valley Native Nursery and also Oregon Natives, which is out in Karis. So. But we just use the real basic pedestrian native plants.
And then does the city or the state, do they provide any technical guidance to you if you request it? Or?
Nope, it's all volunteer driven. And they do supply us with money. We do get money for the plants. And of course, we shop around, we try to get the best price. We don't go to Bosque Del, we go to the wholesaler, because we buy thousands of plants when we plant.
So do you have any idea how much staff time the city there puts into this, to supporting volunteers?
I did ask for that information,
Yeah.
and I didn't get a firm number, but it's not much. It's really the delivery of gravel as a resource, and probably some staff time to do some printing for the brochures that I pass out, that are in my silent salesman on my trails, and that's about it. We are very self-sufficient in that respect.
Does the group sort of report to both the city and the state on occasion to give them updates?
Yes.
Okay.
We report to the city monthly, or Dave Cruz probably does it every week when he does a summary.
I see.
And then I report to Solve, because when you have the kind of volunteers I have, that's an issue about safety coverage. So Solve, everyone has to sign a waiver. And they also help with the outreach. So people can come in and they feel safe, they sign a waiver, and we give them the equipment they need, the gloves, the tools. We give them some basic instruction. And then I send the results to Solve, and the Solve does data collection on that. And I've gotten a little bit of grant here and there, but the city's been very generous in And I don't know if they get any money from the state. I kind of doubt it.
How about Metro? Are they involved at all?
Metro has, there was a grant that the city wrote for a new restroom that was installed.
Oh, capital grant program.
Capital
Yeah.
grant. No.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any more
Thank-
questions?
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We appreciate it very much. Thank you. Lori's also a member of the Heritage Waters Habitat Task Force that was helping to support development in this city and also over in West Lynn.
I think it's just so exciting what Oregon City's doing. I'm just thrilled that, all of the changes. Oh, and I'm also, FYI, just before I leave. Sure. Before I leave, one of the things that the city of West Lynn is also excited about is their partnership with Wes and what we call the Mill Pond property. And please visit, I believe it's called Visualize Willamette, if you have any ideas of what you'd like to see. Brian has talked about it becoming a bird sanctuary. Some other people want a hotel there. There's all kinds of different opportunities, either economic or environmental. I would like to see a partnership in a regional park, so and a kayak landing, that kind of thing. So visit our City West Lynn website, and I believe it's called Visualize Willamette. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
And good luck.
Okay. So we have public comment on items not listed on the agenda. And anybody? Okay. Go right ahead.
About 12 or 13 years. That happened to me before. I think I learned.
You okay?
Anyway, the Mogop neighborhood actually had a project with the neighborhood association with the Friends of Trees, and a lot of the trees that are planted in the parking strips in the Mogop neighborhood were through relation with the Friends of Trees. So I'm sure other neighborhoods could participate. And all it took actually was a $10 commitment on the part of people that own houses there for a tree, and then they worked with the various nurseries and so forth, and the trees were probably worth $25, $35, and the individuals that wanted them planted only had to come up with $10. So it didn't take much in the way of resources to do that for street trees. So
Okay.
All right, excellent.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, if there's no one else, we'll move on to our report on the Clackamas Cove Peninsula Stabilization Project, or study, I should say.
All right. So I'm briefly going to go over what we have learned to date with respect to some of the issues that you raised. Brian had sent some photos to us from his recent visits down to the Cove, and we forwarded those along to Nancy Crawshar, our city engineer, and she is preparing to come up and give you a full report about this in June. We're going to do a site visit in May, and briefly I looked over some of the materials that she had provided this afternoon for me to look over because she's been out of town, but I think it was 2002, 2003, the city had applied to the Corps of Engineers, and there was a biological opinion for the work that was proposed to be done along the southern shore of the peninsula there, and I think it was about a 350-foot section of that they ultimately got a permit for to stabilize. And Richard can speak to that in more detail too, because he worked on the project. It was a significant amount of work, and historically, since I think 1970, there's been erosion on that peninsula to some extent, and it was pretty significant back in 1999 when it prompted that initial study. So those are some of the materials we'd like to provide more background on, as well as what efforts the city's going to be making to address any current concerns. So we'll be doing a site visit on May 15th as staff with Scott Archer and with Nancy Kroshar. And then we'll be reporting back to you at the June meeting.
What time is the site visit?
I don't know yet. That's kind of dependent on Nancy's schedule, but I can find out. Tony, do you have anything to add on that? That's basically it. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think that was a public works project that was a little bit before.
Yeah, it was urban renewal funding, I think, that provided the money for the both the study and the work ultimately. Right.
Okay.
There are some photographs that are very good photos of all the work that was done from the start to finish, and about 50 that I was going to put in a PowerPoint, but I think it would be better to do that in June.
I think that, trying to remember when it was sometime last year, I believe, that CH2M Hill, David Evans was out there and did an reinspection of the site, and I believe that there is probably some write-up of that inspection.
Okay.
It was associated with another project, but while they were out there, they had a quick look at it just to follow up and see what condition it was in. So hopefully we can provide that when Nancy comes back to present.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a
Could
question.
could the presentation next month include a brief introduction to the Cove and kind of the issues, how we've gotten to this point?
Yeah, I think so, because there's a lot of history on the site. Initially, it was farmland, then it became a quarry, and then it filled with water, and now it's considered part of the Cove area. So it's very active, obviously. So
Yeah, there's
Is the walkthrough, is that open to others that could accompany the process? I know that area very well,
Yeah.
extremely well.
I don't know much of the details about the walkthrough yet. I just know that
Okay. Well, if there was an
Nancy
opportunity,
wants to kind of
I-
limit it to
I think
staff.
a few of us
initially.
might be interested. Richard knows the area very well, too. The other aspect I was going to comment on, I guess briefly, was in the master plan for the Cove, it shows about a 4,000-foot trail, 3,500-foot trail, leading from one end to the other. And the more I've thought about this, and I've talked to the developers about this numerous times, and I don't know who else I've talked to, but it just seems to me it is so oversteeping, that whole thing, so terribly violated because of the river on one side, the other side's not so bad. And I understand that the Cove is coming in for final consideration perhaps in the next few weeks, next week.
I don't know the status of that.
My question, I guess, is in their thinking, whoever's looking at it, I hope they'll consider the prudence of putting people out there. One, because it's dangerous during the winter, very dangerous. And two, because more people we put out there, some of the failure areas are occurring where people have created very difficult access, which has led, in some cases, to more erosion. And then I guess the last thing is that because of the consideration for dredging the channel below that peninsula to allow water interchange to occur in the Cove, we can't afford to have the thing continue to slough off in a $500,000 potential cost of dredging project. So
Yeah.
one of the issues to me is it's very important to not see it affected adversely by people's actions, I
Right.
guess. So,
Yeah, I know that these issues are pretty complicated, and we kind of look at them separately, but see how they relate together, because obviously the land itself is, underneath is owned by the Urban Renewal Commission, and they have a stake in getting a viable development project in there. Then you've got the Marine Board, you've got the Marine Fisheries, you've got Oregon, the Corps of Engineers, who all are reviewing this. So but we will definitely provide an update on what the development status is when we look at this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, now we have overview of the Oregon City Municipal Code on tree protection.
Thanks. So we decided to not try to approach all the code sections that deal with natural resources at once. So this is just one code section. That is Chapter 17.41 of our code. This code was developed in 2008 and amended again, I think, in 2010 during the NRC's hiatus. If you'd been here, we would have run it by you, but you weren't, so we went with the Planning Commission and the City Commission.
Sure.
And, yeah. Parts of the code were borrowed from our existing subdivision code because that subdivision code had a section that dealt with tree removal and replacement. So that code was taken out from the subdivision section and put into the Chapter 1741, and that basically said if you are doing a construction project or development project, whether it be a land division or a site plan and design review or a master plan or some kind of commercial development or residential, whatever, you would identify all trees on your site that were 6 inches or greater in diameter at breast height. And then you would show where your future construction areas are going to go on that same site plan, and you'd overlay those two basic layers and determine where these trees are in relation to future construction footprints. All of this based on the understanding that there's an underlying base zone with allowed uses in that zone, such as single-family residential homes or certain types of retail, all those permitted land uses in our code. And then whether the tree fell into a construction area, which you could not avoid, or whether the tree fell into a setback area, which you ostensibly could avoid removing, that would determine whether you mitigated for that tree or not. And previously, if that tree fell into a construction area, whether that was a sidewalk or a building footprint or an easement, you did not have to mitigate for that tree removal in the past. And in 1741, when it was amended, there's a table in there, and that table is, see, on page 6, starts on page 5 of 11. And we now require that trees that are removed from within a construction area do have to be replaced at a slightly smaller ratio than trees that are removed from outside the construction area, and that's based on the diameter of the trees. So for a tree from 6 to 12 inches, if it's removed outside of a construction area, 3 new trees are required to be replaced, and if it's within, it's 1 tree replaced, and so on. So up to a maximum replacement requirement, if a tree is 31 inches or over in diameter, an applicant will be required to replace it with 15 trees if that tree could have been ostensibly saved, but if not, 5 trees. So the code was rewritten with 4 options in mind. The first option being tree removal and replanting. The other options were designed to be incentives for tree retention. Option 2 is tree preservation with within subdivisions on partitions, and the applicant for a subdivision could choose this option and put trees in a tree protection tract within that subdivision. And in recognition of that, would be permitted to have reduced lot sizes and reduced setbacks, as is discussed later in the code. So that was the incentive that was built in for that sort of thing. Similarly, on a smaller land division, which is 3 lots or more, rather than provide a tract, which might take up a large chunk of property, you could choose to protect the trees in a grove through a protective deed restriction, and that's an option under 1741-110 restrictive covenant. And each of these options has sort of specified permitted adjustments that are very specific, that would be discussed with an applicant prior to a land use application. And what essentially staff is doing is hoping that the applicant will recognize the value of these significant trees on their property and come forward with a protection proposal. It's not requiring protection of trees, but it is requiring mitigation of any trees that are removed, and it's providing significant incentives to lot dimensions and lot setbacks, for example, for trees that they would like to preserve in perpetuity. The other thing that was written into the code was specifications for tree protection during construction, which is basically once you get your preliminary site plan approval or your preliminary plat approval, there'll be conditions of approval attached to your land use approval that require that all tree protection measures be in place. So fencing of the drip line is required with a 4-foot fence with 10-foot posts, and it's specified that tree protection zone remain in place throughout the remainder of the construction activities. It specifies that there can be no driving or dumping of materials or hazardous chemicals and things of that nature within that tree protection zone. That's pretty straightforward. To date, the majority of the land use applications that we see opt for option 1, which is tree removal and replacement according to the mitigation tables in the code. Since the code was adopted, I have not seen anybody take, select option 2 or option 3. And then the final option, which is fee in lieu of mitigation, is a cash in lieu of planting, and the city has got a dedicated tree fund set up to allow this option if it's chosen by the applicant. And the applicant may select this option instead of or in addition to any of the other 3 options. We base the price of the tree mitigation on our estimates that we got from various nurseries and landscaping companies that take into account the price of a new tree and transportation and installation of a new 2-inch caliper tree. And then that is adjusted with the consumer price index yearly in our planning review fee. Currently, it's set at $290, I think, or close to it.
What is the amount?
$293 per tree.
Installed. Installed price?
Yes, yeah. Let's see. What else? I tried to bring you an example of a typical tree preservation plan to describe how this plays out during the review process. So I'm going to click on that. And it should, what I did was when you open up this document on your computer, you should see 3 red text boxes. Hopefully it shows up. Yeah, okay. So if you zoom in on this is a subdivision of 13 lots. It's off of Pease Road. It's been approved about 5 years ago. So it would have been approved under previous code, but the basic strategy is described here. Let's see, are you able to zoom in on that? Yeah,
I'm not getting the packet to come up at all.
it's not coming
It's
up.
under-
Coming up for me. It might take.
There we
a-
go. I got it.
Okay.
How do you get it up here?
Yeah, the hidden document.
And if that's
Oh,
a
there it
problem,
goes.
I can
There it
show.
goes.
Yeah.
So if you zoom in on lots 2 and 3 and 4, you'll see, basically, you'll see the lot lines. You'll see a dashed line on the inside of the lot lines that represents a hypothetical building footprint based on the minimum setbacks of that zone. You see what I'm talking about there?
Yeah.
It's sort of a light gray dashed line. And then outside of that, the applicant has shown all of the trees over 6 inches in diameter, and they would have turned in a tree table identifying these. It's kind of faint to see what the existing trees are, but the ones that they've designated for removal are X'd out. And so to the north side of Lot 2, I marked that one. That's just outside the dashed line, and between the lot line and the dashed line is it's removed in the setback area, and that requires mitigation according to column 1. And then to the rear of that lot, there's quite a few trees in a band that the applicant has shown a tree protection fence around. And those are intended to stay, and they need to put that fence up before any grading or construction activities occur, and I need to go out and inspect that site and make sure those are in place prior to grading issuance. And then the Lot 4 further down, you'll see a tree, 12-inch deciduous tree marked as being removed from within the building footprint. That one would require mitigation pursuant to column 2 of Table 1741-060-1 with one tree. The 12-inch evergreen that's shown on Lot 2 there that's going to be removed requires 3 trees be replaced on the lot because it's within the setback. And that's basically how option 1 works. Yeah.
Quick question, is that somewhere in the development that has to be replaced, or is it more specific than
That
that?
gets tricky. We require not only the mitigation plan, but a replanting plan as well, showing where on-site the trees are going to be replaced. And this 1741 code actually requires that the mitigation trees be permanently protected through a deed restriction. So if they're removed because they're hazardous or whatever reason, they are replaced. So you don't lose that canopy once the lot's sold, and the owner is basically aware when they buy the property and they read the title report that is an encumbrance on the property. The second site priority for replanting is, and mitigation trees are counted separately from street trees. Street trees are the trees in the public right-of-way, which are required to be planted by the developers. So these mitigation trees are in addition to any street tree planting requirements, which is governed by a separate section of code, Chapter 1208, which we'll talk about. I think we've talked about that a little bit, but we can talk about that again in the future. Let's see. Sometimes, if it just turned out that the owner or the developer was like, I don't want to do the mitigation on site, I want to do the fee in lieu of planting, then that isn't an option that we will entertain. But the mitigation requirement is prioritized in the code. So another example of where mitigation has been required, but I didn't provide it to you, is Off of Warner Parrott Road in Kenema to the south is the McCarver House and McCarver Landing subdivision, where the original McCarver home was preserved by the developer, and then they did an 18-lot subdivision while leaving the original historic house on a larger lot within the subdivision. They also did about 54 heritage tree, because there was black locusts that were very important on the site historically. So they tried to preserve as many black locusts as they could, but a lot of them were in very poor shape. So they figured out with an arborist's help which of them could be practically preserved and which ones could not, and then did plantings on site on each of the lots to mitigate for that. And that was back in 2005. So,
Question about the
yeah.
tree protection.
Mm-hmm.
Does that require fencing at the drip line of the canopy, or does it extend further out than the drip line?
At a minimum at the drip line, I believe, is what it says. No farther than 10 feet, okay, shall be installed at the edge of the tree protection zone or drip line, whichever is greater. So that's under 1741-130B2. And in some cases, especially on commercial sites, you'll have existing trees where the edge of the drip line extends over pavement, so you're just working within the existing constraints that you've already got because of the size of landscape islands and things like that. But to the extent that we can, at least we get the construction fence right at the existing drip edge. Yeah. So, and then in some properties, and we'll talk about 1749, which is a separate piece of code. We'll talk about that in the future. But in some properties, you may have all three tree protection codes working together. So, well, not tree protection codes, but you've got 1741, which is this code, 1749, which is the Natural Resource Overlay District Code, which has separate mitigation requirements, and then the street tree requirements on top of it. So in certain cases, you end up with a lot of mitigation trees, and you're very constrained planting areas because you've got an urban development with, maybe where 40 to 50% of the lot is covered by buildings and parking, and they're required to do landscaping as part of their site plan and on a commercial property. But
And we also have the new single-family front yard landscaping requirements.
that's right. Yeah.
Which require a tree.
Yeah. So any new single-family residential building permit now has front yard landscaping requirements, which include trees in the front yard.
How does that interact with mitigation trees?
Well, that applies whether or not there's been a mitigation tree in the past, but you can count existing tree caliper towards that requirement by preserving a tree. Basically what that code says is you have to preserve or plant 4 inches of tree caliper on a single-family lot front yard.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if there's also a requirement for mitigation trees, is that in addition, instead of?
Well, in addition to, most likely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It depends on the situation, but we usually end up with 2 separate tables almost.
Yeah.
Because the street trees are required. 1 street tree
Yeah.
every 35 feet. And that's not considered mitigation. The front yard landscaping isn't considered mitigation. But you may be in a situation where the developer is able to identify certain trees for preservation on the lot, and we created a list of significant trees. So, for example, if you protected a white oak, and it's X inches in diameter, we actually give you a credit plus a little bit more because that's one of those designated trees that we definitely want to protect. So, you've got 100 inches of mitigation, you protect some white oaks, and that gives you a credit of 25, let's just say. So now you're down to 75. So you end up with a couple different calculations to get to what the final number is on the site. But we do try and keep them separate, where street trees are street trees, and mitigation trees go with the site development.
And natural resource overlay district or water resource trees are separate mitigation
Yeah.
because
And,
that deals with water
Well,
quality.
there would certainly be lots, or developments with no trees to start with, and
Right.
they would only get those required ones that you were referring to.
Correct.
So,
Did I hear you say, Pete, that nobody has chosen dedicating a preserve or a tract? Very few people have done that, if anybody, to date?
Let me think. I'm not familiar with
That-
any large subdivisions that have done that. I think we have discussed restrictive covenants on smaller partitions with certain people, but
Okay, did you get any response to those kind of,
not today, no.
all right?
Yeah. I
And
think
in
so.
light of that, what I heard you and Tony talk about, then do those things if a tract gets preserved, as if you'd count a oak tree as valuable, 25-inch diameter oak, got a need to mitigate for 100 inches worth of loss, you get a 25-inch credit. If a tract was preserved that had various elements, understory, just who knows what it is, a tract, would it count similarly towards the mitigation requirements?
Just the trees.
Yeah, it doesn't
Only-
really
only
get
those
into
three.
the ecological structure kind of part of it.
Yes.
That was in 1721 actually talked about tree species, which we haven't discussed yet, but
Okay.
what Tony was referring to. This basically says the size of the tract shall be the minimum necessary as recommended by a consulting arborist to adequately encompass the drip line of the tree, protect the critical root zone, and ensure long-term survival of the grove. And then prior to any final plat, ownership of the tree grove or tract and maintenance of the tract shall be identified to ensure that we know who is the responsible party for long-term maintenance, whether it's dedicated to a conservation organization, to a homeowners association, to the city, or to the private homeowner. But no, this code, when it was written, didn't look at species. It only looked at
assemblages,
size.
the value of assemblage within a
Right.
tract.
The one
It's counted.
caveat to that, Jerry, is an applicant does have the option under a Type 3 discretionary land use review process of proposing an alternative mitigation. The reason this code is so detailed is because it deals with clear and objective standards for land use approval, which
Right.
residential largely, which is required by state law. And if somebody wants to go and preserve something with a different plan that is outside of the realm of this, the alternative would be go to the planning commission and then have a suitable professional justify that plan to the planning commission. And that's the way this is set
And
up.
that type
Yeah.
of an application would be routed through the Natural Resource Committee.
It's not specified in here, but that would make perfect sense because under your bylaws, you review land use applications that have the potential to significantly affect natural resources. So yes.
So,
Yeah.
and I guess,
Yeah.
I'm not, I think one thing that we discussed, and to just backtrack a little bit, because it does get a little bit confusing in the land use process, because we essentially have 4 different review types that we're allowed to do.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if that would be something helpful to this committee to understand how we make decisions, clear and objective, quasi-judicial versus I mean, there's terms that we use every day that impact what we would be bringing to you in terms of a land use application for review and the reasons why, which may be helpful to understand why certain codes are written the way they are or why your bylaws are written the way they are, because we do have some limitations. And if that's something you're interested in, that is certainly something we could put together and bring forward
think it
for a
would really help.
presentation.
I think it would help.
Help
All right.
a lot. Well, I heard Peter, you talk about, Tony, type 1 or type 2, type 3. How many types are there of land use decisions? Type 1 through 4 or something?
4
Or-
plus a legislative process.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that last one?
So,
Negotiated process?
no. Type 1 would be something like a lot line adjustment.
Okay.
You're moving a lot line. There's no discretion. Either the lot sizes, you have 2 lots next to each other, you're going to move a line over.
Okay.
Either both sides still meet the minimum requirements of the zone as they're adopted, or they don't. There's no discretion, there's no bargaining, it's either yes or no. Type 2 is what we call clear and objective, and that's where predominantly it's a state requirement. It really focuses specifically on residential, that state law says you have to provide a clear and objective path for residential development to move forward if it meets the criteria adopted by the local jurisdiction. And so that's where you get into, the lot sizes. If they meet the minimum, they get to go forward. Street widths. If they meet the street width that's adopted, they get to move forward. So that's where we have these clear and objective standards. That was what Pete was talking about, why this is so detailed.
Yep.
If you take out one tree, if we say you need to replant it with one tree, or if we adopt it and say you got to have 10, whichever it is, if they do that, they get to move forward. And if they want to cut down 100 trees and put back 100 others, if that's what our code said, that's allowed. It's not a debate. This is what your code says. I'm doing exactly what your code says. Type 3 is what we call discretionary. So it's taken out of the staff level. We write a staff report with a recommendation. Type 3s go to the Planning Commission. So that'd be like a variance to a building height or a conditional use. So you've got permitted uses in a zone. You can build a retail use or a commercial use. But if you want to put a drive-through in, we've decided in certain zones that's a conditional use. In some situations it makes sense, in some situations it doesn't. And that discretion of where it's compatible, where it fits in, goes to the Planning Commission. And so that's where that alternative mitigation comes in, because they're stepping out of that clear and objective, and they're saying, I think I've got a better way to do this. Your code didn't envision this, but we're going to take it to that next level and prove that it meets or exceeds the objectives of what you're trying to do. Type 4 decisions go to the City Commission, and those would be things like a zone change on a property. So you're changing the actual zoning, what's allowed on the property. And then legislative, and those are specific to a parcel or a property or a project. A legislative action is something that you see that affects multiple properties. So if we went in and when we redid our comprehensive plan, that's a legislative action. Or if we rewrote the tree protection code, that would apply to all the properties in the city. So that's a legislative action because it's not targeted at one specific property. And really the difference is that there's a different hearing structure. Type 1, 2, 3, and 4 have a certain set of noticing requirements, comment restrictions, timelines. Legislative is a little bit different because it is citywide. So while they both go to the City Commission, it's just there's just different state requirements for noticing. So that's really the main difference there. But I think it'd be very helpful because it is confusing. There's a lot to it, but I think it would give you a good background as to understanding.
Well, type 1 stuff is what you guys interact with in a very direct way, and it seems like that's absolutely your purview. Type 2, it sounds like, is that mainly your purview?
That is our purview.
Okay, and type 3 is when there's other options to be considered and somebody wants to take their options to the Planning Commission. They either agree or deny, and it seems like then it would move to the City Commission for, if the person wanted to, the applicant, for another consideration. Is that true?
Well, any decision we make other than a Type 1 is appealable to the City Commission.
Okay.
A Type 1 or a Type 2 can be appealed to the City Commission. A Type 1 decision is appealed to the Circuit Court.
All right. And then I see the type 4 be like, basically the City of Bend probably had to interact, well, maybe they didn't, had an interest probably in interacting with Sun River as a major development that might have impact on their community. And that's the kind of thing, or the Cove is another example of a big scale project that the City Commission got involved in.
No. The Cove is a Type 3. It's
Type
a master
3,
plan.
okay.
But so it'd be if someone, like I said, if someone wanted to come in and change the zoning on their property, they're zoned R10. They can have 10,000 square foot lots. They want to have 6,000 square foot lots. So they're going to request a zone change from R10 to R6. That type of action on a single property goes to the City Commission for approval.
What's an example of a type 4 recently?
Okay.
That would be one, rezoning.
Well, recently,
Oh,
Yeah.
recently?
development's been pretty slow. It's been a while since we've had a type 4 type of decision.
Variances to the land use code are type 3, so they don't go out to the city commission, but they go to the planning
Well,
commission.
probably the last thing we adopted through the city commission was the legislative action when we adopted the last round of code changes in 10.
Except for detailed master plans and master plans for very large sites, like those go to the city commission, so,
No.
don't they?
No.
No, just planning commission. Yep, sorry, got mixed up.
But like I said, it's more. I think it's more for just understanding why we have certain limitations as to what we can
Right.
do and how we write it.
Right.
And a clarification too of just, for example, the subdivision where they cut down all the trees. Why wouldn't, even if that happened today, we can have a discussion about notifying you. But in terms of the comment, it was clear and objective, and they did exactly what our code said, and that's the hard part, is that you can't write a code for everything. It's kind of like you write the code for that 2-3% that just aren't going to do it right. Most people usually do exceed it, but. So if that's something you're interested in, like I said,
That would be
we'd be
good.
happy to put that together, and I think it would be a benefit for you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it would definitely help us because I think that's been an issue in the past.
I agree.
Last NRC, that was always an issue.
Yeah,
What can we comment on
Right.
and have an impact?
correct. Yep, and I know that was a major frustration in a communication disconnect between the city and the NRC.
Either one of the other of you said earlier that in our operating document called the ordinance that established this group, we're supposed to look at things, we are to look at things that have an impact on the natural resources of the city, I thought I heard you say. And I've looked at that ordinance very much in detail. So I guess in your mind, just talking generally now, when do you think something might come to us?
It will.
Or would it?
It won't come to you. The developer won't come to you and make a presentation.
Nope.
So I think here was part of the frustration, is that if it's a type 2 decision, the NRC would want to look at it and they'd say, oh, we want them to change this, we want them to change this. And we're a little bit stuck because if they're meeting the code, I want them to save that grove of trees over there. We can't force someone to do that. If they want to cut them down and replant per our mitigation schedule, we've decided as a community that that's acceptable in our code. Okay. Now, if it was a type 3 application, for example, the master plan for the Cove, we would send you the application and say, NRC, do you want to comment on this application? The hard part is that while the Cove was an extensive project, it was a 10-year master plan with 8 phases of development. And so the question is, if they're meeting the code requirements for natural resource overlay district, which is our wetland buffer, our stream buffer, it makes it hard. It's like, oh, we want more trees planted in there, and then if they're not going in there to impact it, though, that's where it gets a little bit difficult. So, it's you've been given a power, but I don't think you've been given the explanation of to what extent you can use that and how much of an impact you can have. And I think that's a conversation we need to have to avoid future frustrations and miscommunications.
That sounds good.
It would be included. They're an advisory board, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to get too long, and we'll cover a lot of this next time. For City Commission, Planning Commission, and the Historic Review Board make land use decisions. They issue decisions.
The Historic Review Board.
The Historic
How's that
Review
power?
Board has over the McLaughlin Conservation District,
Okay.
the Kenema Historic District, and certain designated structures. They actually make a final decision that's then appealable through the City Commission in the court system, the Land Use Board of Appeals. Planning Commission has that same ability. This commission, Transportation Advisory Committee, PRAC are advisory in nature. So you don't actually make a land use decision. You can make recommendations that get incorporated in the staff report and become part of the record. So that's the role. It's is advisory to add comments for information that then gets considered by the decision maker. So it's a little bit different role.
Yes.
It does require that, those comments go through the committee if you're going to form a consensus recommendation on any land use action we're reviewing. And there's a significant amount of research time and that sort of thing that goes along with that. So.
I guess those are public hearings, therefore,
Yes.
some representative of the body can actually testify in front of
Yeah.
the planning commission.
Yeah, and-
On appeal, testify before the city commission.
Yeah, and there's also public comment on many issues
Right.
that would be incorporated as well, or at least considered.
And I guess I'm just trying to. We could send you every application we get, but if they're a type 2, you've got to, that's where it's like, if it meets the code, it meets the code. I mean, that's the whole clear and objective, black and white. It's not a negotiation. We're not horse trading.
Right.
Either it is or it isn't. There's no, I wish we could do this, or go make them do that. Go make them exceed the code. That's where I think there was a lot of the miscommunication last time. Why didn't you make them go do that? Well, they met the code. We're at a type 2 decision. We're not back there making deals and we'll give you this if you give me that. It's not allowed. And so I think that's something I think that would be helpful for everyone to kind of get a basic understanding of.
Let me ask a specific question about Thayer Road for just a second. When Thayer Road was initially considered by the Planning Commission, it must have been a type 3. Is that true?
Yep.
And at that time, there was concern about trees and setbacks, and I don't remember what. One of the Planning Commission members had concerns about architecture, design, whatever. Planning Commission denied it. Then it went on to City Commission. City Commission also denied it. At that stage, the people that had made comment, including myself, probably another 20 or so people, were they to be included in any future negotiations, any future considerations of that development if it moved to type 2? If it moved to a different type,
No,
is there a
it's-
notice requirement?
No.
Okay.
Because at that point, the application's denied.
Is denied.
So if they come back in, we start the whole process again.
All right. So then for myself, as an example, and others, they should have been tracking the movement of the project into the type 2 process level, and they could or could not have made comment.
Oh, yes, you can. It's
But that'd be considered by you primarily.
correct.
Or your staff.
So
Okay.
a type 2 decision, since it's just staff and there's no public hearing,
Right.
the only comment we accept is written comment.
All right.
And then if it's a type 3 or a type 4 or a legislative,
Right.
you can submit written comment that gets put into the record and forwarded, or you can submit written comment and come and testify at the Planning Commission. So you can do both written and oral argument if it's a type 3 or type 4 because you have the opportunity of public hearings.
And then this ordinance that we're looking at tonight, this particular part of, this part that deals with trees, refers to arborists as a consulting expertise. Doesn't say forester, says arborist specifically. I remember Doug and I were involved with Metro on the Green Space Committee for a while, and I remember talking to the man who acquires all the land, who I have a lot of respect for, an attorney that heads up all the efforts to acquire their properties. And I asked him, what do you do about you get into situations where an arborist report will say something about a wildlife habitat area that you're concerned about, but it would tend to look at it from the standpoint of urban forestry or urban forest canopy versus a biological value? What do you do? And he said, we always have a biologist involved in all those opinions. I guess my question would be, we can't do anything about this now, but do you think a process could be established where something significant that has some value that is type 3 or type 2 could have a referral to a biologist to give you some additional input? Type 3 would be to the Planning Commission, where the biologist and the arborist together can...
We're regulating trees. We're not regulating understory.
Right.
We don't have upland habitat
Right.
requirements. So,
There are cavity nest sites,
And
there
if-
are nesting areas within those trees. Just asking.
That is not applicable.
Okay, all right.
You would essentially have to map all of that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, Doug was wanting to comment, but go ahead.
You know, all things times some things come up where the code doesn't address certain things, and they've been triggers for the commission to reconsider the code. The steep slopes ordinance is a great example of that, where Friends of Newell Creek had tremendous impact in terms of getting that code redone. And actually, there's been subsequent revisions when we things that we didn't envision that would happen under the code where we thought we were protecting the slopes did happen, and we revised the code again. I don't know how many times it's been revised. So even though there might be frustration on things that we currently have in the code that, you know, you would have no say over on a given development, it doesn't mean that the code could be changed for things that would occur in the future. And this has happened numerous times, I believe.
Certainly. Yeah, and I think just in response to the specific question about nesting habitat, you get into a situation where you would, if it's a type 2 decision or even a type 3 decision, you can't, it's almost like a safe harbors. Your code identifies what you protect, and that's why we have, you know, streams, wetlands, all those are mapped. And that's how we get to be able to regulate and enforce our code on those. So, you know, if you're into a situation where you're looking, you know, to just say we're going to protect nesting habitat, birds nesting in trees, okay? We can certainly bring our attorney in and we can have that discussion because they've probably talked about that before. But, you know, even the federal government only protects that only certain parts of the year. To say, you know, I'm not going to take down a tree because it has a nest in it, you know, that would put an onus on us. A, we'd probably have to go out and identify them all so that the property owner is aware that we're adopting a regulation that restricts the use of their property. I mean, I would first have the conversation about regulating trees on private property before I went to that step. You know, that's just something that we don't do. We haven't done that, and I'm sure you're all aware of how that conversation has gone, the pluses and the minuses that have happened throughout the state on regulating the cutting of trees on private property. You know, so I mean, it's incremental. I think you know it's a discussion that we continue to have every time.
It'd be more value to do it through an incentive approach, which.
Yeah.
That's why I kind of started off my little questions about, you know, how many people had ever chosen the restrictive covenant or the preserved tracts and so forth, and do they have value in terms of how you quantify mitigation requirements? And right now they don't. So, I mean, that would be an easier one to make a movement in that direction to say that a tract that has more value because it's contiguous and has understory and whatever, down woody, standing wood, whatever, that would, I would think it'd be an easier one to encourage people to consider if they would get a benefit, you know, in negotiating for what they need to do when they are mitigating.
Yeah, I think the incentive and education and outreach component for private property owners has significant benefit. And, you know, and I know that's what Eric's agency is involved with is voluntary work on private property and public property.
And,
so,
you know,
Right.
here's the part where when I hope that we have these discussions that we're able to have them that, you know, for every action we make, there's a reaction to that.
Right.
Okay, so we've identified wetlands and we want a 50-foot buffer around the edge of a wetland, all the way around it. But we've allowed folks to do what we call a density transfer. Okay, so you've got 10 acre, or you know, our 10 lots, so you got 4 units per acre, roughly. You know, if you've got a wetland that takes up half of that 1 acre, you can transfer that density to the parts that are outside of that wetland. But what that means is that you are, you know, so at 4 units per acre, that means you have 4 10,000 square foot lots roughly per acre. Now you're going to put those 4 on a half an acre. So now you're going to have 4 lots at 5,000 square foot in a neighborhood that's all 10,000 square foot lots. So through our incentivizing and trying to protect natural resources, it's led to smaller lots being in neighborhoods that have larger lots. And sometimes that's an issue. And so to say, let's just, to incentivize it, which is what we've done there, there's always going to be a little bit of a pushback. So when we come in and kind of say, we need to do a better job of this, of just, here's what we see when we implement this. And we're not saying we don't agree, we're not saying we don't like it, we're just saying, here's what you're might hear, and here's what we've seen historically as the pushback when we do things like this. Because I think that's important to understand.
Mm-hmm. And make it politically correct and in vogue. Make it the kind of thing that people want to do because they're so excited about it. Now, my case from bringing that up is that I think you had something to do with it. If not you, Tony, directly, both of you. There's a pond on Myers Road. That pond was going to be drained and filled. And the person at that time that owned that property came to me and asked me to help him identify the boundary, and I did, though I didn't know much at that time. I tried. But it's got woody structure all around it. You can drive right by it on Myers Road. I encourage this group to do it. Apartments in the background, buildings over here, church over here. It's amazing in terms of a good example. And I guess I'd rather see us as an advocacy group, which I think is something Richard wants to talk about at some time in the future here, is advocacy. Get people out to look at things in the field that were really done well, because there's great examples. There are.
You talking about the Settlers Point pond?
I'm not sure what I'm talking about. It's a pond up Myers Road.
The duck pond.
Yeah.
One we stopped at the other day.
Yeah, that one.
The one where everybody feeds the ducks and I can
Don't feed them. Yeah, no, I was referring to the other pond on Myers Road, which is under the PG power line that the Settlers Point HOA maintains. So that's a pretty nice pond, too.
That's actually quite nice too.
That's a nice one too.
But, okay, well, I'm really glad we did this, and I hope we can hear more. This helps me a lot. I want to know how we can become quasi-judicial, like the Historic Review Board. I didn't know they had those kind of powers. All right.
Okay.
Well, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I know that Richard had some comments on some of the code and the way it's written, and I totally welcome that for the clarity that you could bring to this code. I think we need to next time we reopen the code. There's we keep a running list as we use our codes of all the things that we need to fix. So and I think the question is a good one about what type of professional you have reviewing a specific type of plan. So we said, for the purposes of this plan, a certified arborist or a consulting arborist is appropriate. But we also mentioned a horticulturalist or suitably qualified professional. So there's, and then when we talk about the Natural Resource Overlay District next, 1749, you'll see similar references to suitably qualified professionals. And if that code language needs to be tightened up, or if it's okay, I think the most important thing is the methodology by which it's being done, and that the person who's doing it is suitably qualified. So we don't even mention landscape architects who have extensive years of training in forestry and horticulture and various other things in this code, but they would be considered a suitably qualified professional for certain types of plans. So, anyway.
Good.
I'll make a comment too that we're going to begin to undertake a 2-year review of our comprehensive plan. We're supposed to look at it and make recommendations every 10 years, and that's a process actually that enables us to look more globally, I think, on what we want to do. And it makes sense if we're going to make code revisions to look at it in a more global sense, and that's a mechanism of doing it.
Yes, that's very good.
I might
Very good.
remind the mayor that that's where we started last time,
Yep.
about 10 years ago or so.
That's exactly right.
That was our first job.
That's right.
Yeah.
That was our
Review
first
the
job.
comprehensive plan.
That was when, that was,
It was a very painful process.
Yes, it
because we
was.
hadn't done anything for
No.
25 years.
Yeah.
We went from, we were working off a 1982 comp plan, and that was roughly 2002 through, I think we got it finally adopted in 2004. 22 years, yeah. A long time.
I remember that well,
Yeah.
because that's when our I don't think he was a counselor then, our citizen member was advocating to get rid of the sea lions, and you see how much good it's done. I'm just kidding.
Well, I've run over my time on this item, but I'd be happy to answer questions
Oh, that's
if you
great.
want to
Thank you.
direct them to me via email, and I'll come back and compile them
Right.
later.
Okay.
We're good.
I guess I have one further question, or one additional question to Tony. You mentioned something about a little re-education process here on types and
Yeah,
legislative action
certainly.
and so forth. Are you planning on presenting us with something, or?
Yes, yeah, we work with our city attorney. We have a presentation that we make to our planning commission, historic review board, even the city commission, their new
okay.
members, and we'll tailor that more towards this body. But I mean, we call it land use 101.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, so that'd be a future agenda item. I guess the question is when we do that.
And I realize we want to keep moving, and I, in my opinion, I think it's a good place to start and have a good understanding. So, if you're willing to take a recommendation, I would certainly be happy to get that moving faster than slower, so that it does help you as we start looking at these other things. I would have liked to have had it before tonight. We just didn't really get a chance to do that, because it may have been helpful when you're looking at it to realize, oh, that's why it's written that way.
Okay, any further staff communications before we go on?
Yeah, I'll give you a quick update.
Okay.
We did have an Arbor Day celebration. It was attended by, 150 students from Mount Pleasant, and Tony and Mayor and Parks staff were there, Scott Archer and Larry Potter and myself, yes. So that was very successful. Our Tree City USA application deadline is actually December, so we missed last year's. So we will update it accordingly and get it in the pipe for review. And we'll be compiling our tree data again for 2011. Let's see, we did a watershed tour. Greater Oregon City Watershed held a really interesting tour, and Doug was one of the speakers, and I attended as a participant, but not as a. So it was a lot of fun. It took about 3 hours. We drove around the boundary of Greater Oregon City Watershed, and had really good input from all of the board members and some of the speakers. John Runyon, and who else was on there?
Eric Hand.
Eric Hand.
Stormwater person, and we also had
Rita Baker.
one of the staff
John
members of
Runyon.
the ELC came and addressed us. Danielle, I believe, was her name.
Daniel, Fowler.
We had also a person that was instrumental, although he no longer worked for Stone Creek Golf Course, but went ahead and talked about the mitigation they did there. He subsequently been hired by a major golf association and looking at those kind of issues on a more global basis, which is great. But so we got a chance to see that. I mean, it was
Wow.
and Richard, you were there, and so I don't know if you want to comment.
John Runyon, I believe he did the watershed assessment.
He did the watershed assessment
Yeah.
for the Greater Oregon City Watershed.
And as I understand it, this was sponsored by the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I was duly impressed with the tour. They take in, of course, Oregon City and the urban growth boundary, plus areas beyond that a little bit. And I went on to the website of Oregon City and went into the mapping program. And I know you can't see this, but I put basically a boundary around where, their responsibilities are, and it, you know, it is quite a bit of ways from the urban growth boundary at times. But basically, you know, they take in the watersheds that are kind of originating in this area, you know, which I think is a good
It's the
thing.
Beaver Creek watershed, the Abernathy Creek watershed. We do not invade the Clackamas Basin, River Basin watershed, but then all of the small streams that flow directly into the Willamette between those two. And of course, we contribute both to the Abernathy and the Beaver Creek watersheds, even though Beaver Creek is outside, for the most part, is outside of the mountain.
Yeah.
In fact, it's completely outside of the mountain.
I would like to call on them to kind of get more involved with the Natural Resource Council, because they are, you know, the Oregon City, in the Oregon City area. And I think they
Good
would,
partnership. And,
yeah.
And I introduced Pete there to the group as our staff representative to the Natural Resource Council. And the board knows about you, but we had, of course, people that came all the way from Portland and so forth. It was a good tour, and mentioned that we did have, in fact, a Natural Resource Council, council that works for advisory council for the city.
Yeah, so the community college had a big role in the publicity for this tour. And,
You might
yeah,
want to
yeah.
invite, incidentally, Allison Heimowitz to visit you all, because they are going to a major stormwater planning for the Environmental Learning Center. About 6 or 7 years ago, they came up with this plan. It was a very heavily engineered plan, and really didn't take the vegetation into account and so forth. That's dead, and what this plan that has now been unveiled at this point, I went to a presentation this morning, and I would suggest that you invite them to the college to actually present that plan to you, so you can see what it is, and it's really intended to deal with the treatment of 70% of the water coming out of that area and get it treated before it comes into the river. Has these fingers of waterways and so forth, and looking at habitat and so forth. And Jerry would be very pleased with what's happening there.
Wonderful.
And I would suggest you make that invitation for a subsequent meeting.
I'd like to encourage Richard and I talked a little bit about this. Why are we not, or could we relate more to other organizations? I feel like the watershed assessment that you folks did, Greater Oregon City Watershed Council, on a minimum, we should hear about that, because it's all the watershed elements, as I understand it, and subbasins, assessment done professionally almost. Is that true?
Yeah, John.
And then do the other thing you just talked about, maybe 2 separate presentations, because they're doing good work, and I don't know what the assessment of the conditions are in the other basins that flow into all other waterways except the Clackamas. I don't know. So,
I guess I mentioned this to Pete also. I think that it would be nice to somehow get a listing of all the organizations that are actually working in this basin. There's got to be some kind of synergy there. Maybe they're all working together now, but I got this feeling they're not. And it would be nice to know who's doing what, and somehow do appropriate mapping of projects or whatever, or of interest.
That's right, Richard. Yeah, and I'd mentioned that there are several web-based formats for coordination of disparate agency events. One is the Metro Regional Environmental Information Network, called REIT. Solve manages their own. And what was the other one I mentioned? I forget. But there's 3 major web-based
It might
ones.
be the Conservation Registry.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, the Intertwined Conservation Registry, or is that something
I
different?
think those are two
Yeah,
separate
so
ones. Yeah.
there you go. But just the fact you've got 4 web-based formats out there. The city could provide links to all the organizations on our website. It's fairly straightforward, just.
It just seems like as a natural resource
Yeah.
committee, it would be nice to know what is going on,
Yep.
And I'm not exactly sure how to get to that.
Well, there's we are charged with working with other bodies like the parks and the different wetlands. But, if I was going to do that outreach, I need numbers and so on. That all needs to be made available.
Yeah, right.
So that, it makes that part of the job a little easier.
Yep. So got that written down for future agenda.
Okay.
Final item is this Friday we'll be meeting to do a tour of Waterboard Park at 10 a.m. for those of you who are available and wish to attend. It's not a formal NRC meeting. It's just a tour. So we did send an email out to various groups to as an FYI. So there may be other people along on that tour. And it's an information gathering tour. And we'll be discussing all sorts of things: health, management, maintenance, volunteerism, various other things. And then I anticipate that we will have on our next agenda the nomination item again, because it's been tabled pending this site tour. And we can discuss it in more detail once we've had the tour. So with that,
I just wanted to add real quick, going back to the Arbor Day event.
oh yeah,
We planted trees in Hillendale, Chapin, Clackamas Overflow parking lot, and Mountain View Cemetery. We did 17 with the kids at Chapin, which was fun. All those trees were about 2.5 inches in diameter, and so in total on that day, over that weekend, we planted 44 trees in those parks. And then I'd really like to acknowledge once again IFA Nurseries out of Canby and Willamette Seedling Nursery out of Canby, because they donated all of the seedlings for the kids to take home, and we really do appreciate that. And Willamette Falls did come out and tape everything, so we're hoping we can put something together with all the all the taping and recordings that they did get. It was pretty neat. They went to each of the kids' groups around the trees, and so we're kind of excited to see how that turns out as well.
Okay, good.
yeah, it was fun. So for future agenda items, I've jotted down Land Use 101, potentially invite Clackamas Community College to present their stormwater plan. And then we'll have the Waterboard Park nomination. So that's 3 fairly big ticket items. I would anticipate that Community College, if they accept our invitation, would be in the presentations part of the agenda, about 15, 20 minutes, room for questions. Land Use 101, that takes about, 45 minutes?
I think we want to allow some time for questions if we
Yeah.
have them, so we'll probably be a little conservative on that one
Yeah.
in terms of the time allotment.
That's
If
a
we
lot.
do better, that's great.
And then
Okay.
Waterboard Park, I don't know, if you put it on the agenda and invite public comment during that time, then, I'm not sure how many people will come to talk about it, but,
I would expect some, anyway.
Yeah.
We should have it.
Okay, so I would limit it to those 3 items for now.
Yeah,
Well,
so I guess if we could just have some flexibility in coordinating this, we want to try and manage your agenda so that you're out of here at a reasonable time, I would think.
One thing I was talking with Brian about, do we have a work plan for this group? We have kind of a scope of what we were doing, okay? But we don't exactly have goals that we established for the year.
We have an adopted work plan, but we adopted it based on the understanding that we would be refining it as the year moves forward with responsible parties and tightened up deadlines and dates. But it goes through 2013.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I attempted to do was put together some major areas of interest that I think this group could be effective in, and I, in particular, want the staff to look at this. I gave one to Tony. And I would like the group to, we don't have to go through this tonight, but to discuss this next time, because it has, the intention is to try to create some standards that we might want to respond to. And they're in the areas of encouraging and establishing support within the staff structure, a better relationship with you guys, so we're more effective. Provide and respond to community interests, which is what we're doing a lot of. aiding the staff and your consultant from time to time, developing an interactive, supportive relationship with these other organizations that were discussed already, review ordinances, covenants, and whatever when the time is right, and considering and responding to fish and wildlife and other issues brought forward by staff, citizens, and so forth. And then the last part of the whole thing was determining a focus that we could have for areas we'd focus on in 2012 and 2013. And I'm not going to go through it now. I just was hoping we could, everybody have one, and then we could take a look at it, maybe send it to those people that are not here tonight. And Brian and I talked about it, talked with Richard a bit, but just an attempt. I feel like if we don't have something to kind of focus our energies around some basic things that we feel are important, we might not be as productive as we could be.
Good point.
Enough of that.
And I'm assuming there's agreement from the commission.
Are we, actually,
Tony was just asking.
yeah,
To bring this.
we should technically have a motion if we're going to add this, I suppose.
Okay.
It's up to, I mean, if
Or is it, this is just...
this is just to put it as a future agenda item. You're not really, I think I'm just asking,
Does anybody object to considering these ideas?
Well,
And this is-
can we consider them in relation to what Pete has put together?
for your
already?
work plan?
We should, because I don't have the
Oh,
work
yeah.
plan. Right.
Yeah, we should have that
yeah.
available too.
They
like
should
we did
relate,
earlier.
absolutely.
And I guess, just in times of time management, is this something that can slip a meeting, or, just
It can wait.
if we've got Heritage Tree,
Right.
if we've got Land Use 101, if we get the college to come in here,
Sure, it could
you're
wait.
in for a long night
It could wait.
right there. I'm happy to add it. We'll stay as long as you want, but as the night goes on, your productivity goes down, as does ours.
I think what we need to do is see your work plan, which you
Sure,
assembled
let
for
me-
us, and
yeah.
have it related to this, the two
Right.
together, so because I don't even know what the work plan says.
Yeah, I mean, one item on the work plan that's very specific that we need to really work on is our tree subcommittee updates to our tree list.
Sure.
And that sort of thing, which, I need to generate that.
Oh, wait,
And-
wasn't
yeah.
the Cove on there as well?
And the Cove Peninsula recommendation.
That
So
was going to be June too.
that's June 2.
So,
yeah.
So we can wait on this until
okay,
July
so
or
if
something.
we can have some discretion, because
Yeah.
there's only so much we can get done.
Okay.
Right.
I don't know you need to see the code plan, excuse me. the code plan.
Sorry, I should have
Stormwater
found it.
at the college in June.
Right.
They just unveiled it, really today, although we got a pre-picture of it on the tour. They pulled staff together and so forth and unveiled it this morning. So,
Yeah, we certainly could delay that as well if necessary.
Yeah, so we are planning to report back to you with the Cove update, so that'll
Right.
be in your packets a week in advance of the meeting, so, yeah. Yeah,
One more agenda item might be, again, the Greater Oregon City Watershed
okay,
Committee. Somebody
Yep.
yeah.
from there talking about maybe their watershed assessment, and maybe that would be John Runyon who prepared it, or maybe Rita or someone else.
Yeah.
I've been pretty good about coming to events, even though he did the assessment, he's not being paid for it. I think he probably, and the committee can make that decision, but
Yeah.
he did the assessment.
Yeah, I've got a copy of it, too. Kind of keep all the watershed stuff that's been done over time in one folder. So the city's 1999 local wetland inventory I have, and John Runyon's work with the assessment, and various other things that have been done. But I think we had a big lag of time between the 1999 local wetland inventory and the Greater Oregon City Watershed Assessment. So updating all of that information basically has been in the form of land use actions where a developer has actually responded to the code and gone out and done site-specific delineations based on the code. The city hasn't gone out and updated our water resource overlay district, with the exception of Chapter 1749 and its map, which we'll be presenting to you in the future as part of the updates on the code. Yeah. So, thank you.
Okay.
In our outline for how we proceed here, is there anything for the good of the order? If a board member or somebody else has an announcement they want to make, how do we do that? How is it provided for in this process?
We don't have it on the agenda now, but we can just, normally it's done near the end of a meeting,
Okay.
which is where we are right now. So,
Would you mind if I pass these things around?
go right ahead.
Okay, this is the upcoming Waterboard Park, not the tour to look at trees, it's to look at everything, geology, natural history, the history of the military armory, and Brian and I are doing this on May 19th. Some of you were there, Doug was there. It's going to be more expansive now than it was last time because it includes a look at the military history in detail. We were able to get a hold of some documents provided by the military department about the armory. And one of the things that Norm Stewart is considering right now, since he has dominion over this 100,000 square foot building with the military department, is doing a series of classes starting this summer or fall for sure with Portland State University on natural history and cultural history. And he's actually having people submit ideas to the continuing education department of PSU, which is what I used to do through the Environmental Learning Center. We used to have 21 different classes per year that were continuing ed for professionals or teachers and things like that. So anyway, it's on May 19th, beginning at 9 a.m., concluding at 11. Brian's going to do the walking tour and lots of the natural history aspects. I'm going to do kind of a cultural history overview. Norm's going to talk about the military history with documents that he got from the military department, who's very happy about this kind of idea. And one of the things we're talking about, maybe it's an interim use, I don't know what it is a mustering area, not for military, but a mustering area for volunteers to go out and do work in the city that might have tools and equipment. And he's good at getting grants, and I'm not too bad at that myself, that the military department would see that as a interesting use of that building. It still has to have some military use. Storing military supplies is what it does right now in a small way. And, by the way, it stores your beautiful trolley, too. So, anyway, it's free, donations requested, begins at 9, concluding at 11. That's the Saturday after this coming Saturday.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? I say that this meeting is over then.
Thank you.